Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this inaugural Sport for Flourishing Symposium. Special thanks to Dr. Cowden. He was the one who introduced me in existential positive psychology about 4 years ago, and also invited me into this wonderful group that tries to explore flourishing specifically in sport. My name is Andreas Stamatis. I have a dual appointment. I'm a professor at the University of Louisville in Kentucky, USA. I'm also a program director and a research fellow. I also work as a mental performance specialist for our healthcare system in our athletic department. Today, I want to talk about mental toughness, and if you know me, you know I'm very passionate about it. But I want to talk about mental toughness from a somewhat different starting point. For decades, we have asked important questions about mental toughness. What is it? How do we measure it? How do we develop it? And what does it look in high-level performers of any kind? But there is another question that I think deserves more attention. What is mental toughness for? And closely related to that, what happens when mental toughness has no broader framework above it or below it, depending on how you see it? So today, my argument is not that we need to replace mental toughness, quite the opposite. I strongly believe mental toughness remains one of the most useful constructs we have for understanding functioning under pressure, stress, and adversity in sport. But I also think it needs a home or a new home or a better home. So, what I'm proposing is that existential positive psychology or EPP can provide that home, and in doing so, connect mental toughness more clearly with flourishing. Let me first be clear about what I mean by mental toughness for this presentation, for this work. We define mental toughness, as you can see, as the capacity to function in purposeful, efficient, and flexible ways under pressure, stress, and adversity. This builds on work conceptualizing mental toughness as a broad, coherent construct concerned with sustained, goal-directed functioning in demanding achievement context. And one distinction is important. Purposefulness, efficiency, and flexibility are not three separate dimensions of mental toughness. They describe how mental toughness is expressed. So if we start, purposefulness means that my behavior remains directed towards something that matters. Then efficiency means that I can function without unnecessary psychological or behavioral cost. And the last thing, flexibility, means that I can adapt my regulatory processes, strategies, or even goals as circumstances change. That matters. And that matters because sport inevitably creates situations in which simply doing more is not necessarily doing better. Sport, as you all know, contains pressure, uncertainty, mistakes, injury, failure, role changes, public evaluation, especially now, disappointment, and sometimes even genuine suffering. Mental toughness matters because it speaks directly to the question, how do we function when things become difficult? The problem then, the problem then is not mental toughness itself. The problem is what mental toughness can become when it is separated from a broader account of the person. In everyday sport culture, and I see that in my work, toughness can easily become associated with messages like, as you can see, keep going, control your emotions, do not show weakness, push through, do not complain, get the job done. And sometimes persistence is exactly what the situation requires. But outward behavior alone cannot tell us whether someone is functioning well. Think about this. An athlete can persist while becoming psychologically depleted. An athlete can appear composed while suppressing fear, shame, or distress. An athlete can keep pursuing a goal that no longer makes sense. And an athlete can remain inside an environment that perhaps should not be tolerated at all. The manuscript that we're working on with Drs. Cowden and Gucciardi makes this distinction explicitly. Apparently tough behavior may be psychologically costly, externally driven, or disconnected from meaning. So the question cannot only be, did the athlete persist? We also have to ask, what was the athlete persisting toward? Why did it matter? At what cost? And was persistence actually the adaptive response? This leads to one of central questions of my talk. What is mental toughness without EPP? Again, I am not suggesting at all that mental toughness without EPP is inherently bad. Mental toughness already has a substantial theoretical and empirical literature behind it. The limitation is more fundamental. Mental toughness can tell us something important about functioning under pressure, but by itself, it does not necessarily tell us what that functioning is ultimately for. Without a broader framework, persistence can become blind persistence, control can become suppression, consistency can become rigidity, endurance can become suffering for suffering's sake, and performance can become the primary criterion by which we decide whether the response was successful. This is why purposeful, efficient, and flexible functioning matters. Purposefulness protects toughness from becoming blind persistence. Efficiency protects toughness from becoming psychological overextension. Flexibility protects toughness from becoming rigidity. But even then, another question remains. Purposeful towards what? Efficient in the service of what? Flexible according to which values, which responsibilities, and which meanings? For those questions, mental toughness needs a broader framework. This is where existential positive psychology becomes very useful. EPP gives us a framework broad enough to hold both the positive and difficult dimensions of human experience. It brings adversity, suffering, meaning, responsibility, hope, courage, self-transcendence, and flourishing into the same conceptual space. That breadth matters in sport because a meaningful sport experience is not necessarily one in which pressure disappears, right? Or uncertainty disappears, or failure disappears, or painful emotions disappear. EPP asks a different kind of question. How can people live and function meaningfully and responsibly in the presence of limitation, uncertainty, adversity, and suffering? And in sport, those are not just abstract philosophical questions. They become very practical. Athletes will ask, why does this matter to me? What does this setback mean? Who am I when I cannot perform? What am I responsible for here? What kind of person am I becoming through this experience? And when circumstances change, what is still worth pursuing and what needs to change? And this is why we position EPP as a host framework, not another psychological technique. It does not replace cognitive behavioral approaches, acceptance-based approaches, motivational theories, ecological perspectives, or any other method practitioners already use. It provides a broader account of the person within which those approaches can operate. But EPP is intentionally broad. So we still need a construct that translates this meaning-centered view of the person into the demands of the sport. This is where we think mental toughness becomes particularly valuable. Why mental toughness? Not because it replaces resilience, grit, hardness, coping, or related constructs. It does not. Its advantage here is that mental toughness already speaks the language of sport and achievement. It is concerned with functioning when demands are high, outcomes matter, pressure is present, and adversity has to be negotiated. So, EPP provides the broader understanding of adversity, meaning, responsibility, and flourishing. Mental toughness bridges that understanding into performance context. And the practical question becomes, what would purposeful, efficient, and flexible functioning look like here? Sometimes purposeful functioning means continuing. Sometimes it means changing direction. Sometimes flexibility means changing a strategy. Sometimes it means changing the goal. Sometimes mentally tough functioning means regulating yourself and remaining engaged. And sometimes it means asking for help, reporting an injury, setting a boundary, or stepping back. This is very different from defining toughness as just do more, feel less, stop, never. This also helps where applied mental skills fit because we all care about application here. They matter, the skills, but they come after the conceptual work. All coaches and athletes will ask you, what do I need to do right now? Tell me what to do. But we need to step back for a second. And in our architecture, EPP is the host framework. Mental toughness is the organizing sport relevant construct. Purposeful efficiency and flexibility describe its functional expression. We can then move on and identify psychological resources that may support, enable, or constrain that functioning. And only then do we select techniques such as goal setting, imagery, self-talk, mindfulness, breathing, reflection, routines, pressure training, and so on and so on, and so forth. The important point is those techniques are not mental toughness, they're methods, and the psychological resources we may target are not 8 separate versions of mental toughness. They help us answer a more precise question. What may be preventing this athlete from functioning purposefully, efficiently, or flexibly in this particular situation? Our perspective, therefore, moves from technique first practice towards formulation first practice. So rather than beginning with what technique should I teach, we begin with what is the athlete facing, what does it mean to them, and what kind of functioning does this situation require. And this brings us to flourishing. The definition, as you can see, describes flourishing in terms of relatively enduring personal and systemic quality across the dimensions of existence, supported by the conditions of life. I think both personal and systemic are important here because an athlete can't perform without flourishing. An athlete can persist without flourishing. An athlete can endure without flourishing. And an athlete can even look mentally tough without flourishing. At the same time, flourishing cannot simply mean comfort. Flourishing life can contain disappointment, sacrifice, uncertainty, pressure, limitation, and pain. The presence of difficulty does not mean that flourishing has disappeared, but neither should we romanticize adversity. Difficulty does not automatically create growth. It could produce growth. It can also produce shame, rigidity, avoidance, disengagement, or harm. Now, the systemic part. The systemic part matters as well because we cannot create unhealthy sport environments and then define success as making athletes tough enough to survive them. So our perspective explicitly argues that adversity is not inherently beneficial. Systemic problems should not simply be individualized, and harmful environments should not be addressed by making athletes tougher. So, flourishing gives us a broader criterion. Not simply, can this athlete withstand more, but can this athlete engage what is difficult in ways that remain connected to meaning, responsibility, agency, adaptation, and a life worth living? This is exactly where we think EPP strengthens mental toughness. It gives toughness direction. So perhaps then the practical change is ultimately a change in the question. A narrow toughness question might be, how do we make this athlete handle more pressure? A meaning-centered mental toughness question becomes, how Can this athlete engage this pressure purposefully, efficiently, and flexibly while remaining connected to what matters? I don't know, it may sound to you like a subtle difference. In my world, I think is a substantial one because the goal is no longer simply for me to manufacture harder athletes. The goal is to develop the capacity to engage the realities of sport without disconnecting performance from personhood. Pressure is real, failure is real, adversity is real, and sometimes suffering is real. Mental toughness helps us understand how people function within those realities. EPP asks us to also consider what those experiences mean, what the response serves, and what kind of human functioning we ultimately want sport to cultivate. So I will finish where I began. Thank you for your patience. What is mental toughness for? If mental toughness means only enduring more, suppressing more, and persisting longer, then I'm not sure that that is a form of toughness worth developing. Personally, I'm not interested. But if mental toughness is the capacity to function purposefully, efficiently, and flexibly under pressure, stress, and adversity, then I think it remains an extremely valuable construct. And EPP allows us to take the next step. It reminds us that performance occurs inside a human life, that adversity has meaning, that suffering should neither be denied nor romanticized, that responsibility matters, that adaptive functioning can involve persistence, but it can also involve change. And that the ultimate question cannot only be, did the athlete perform? It also has to include, how did the athlete engage what was difficult? What did that engagement serve? And did it contribute to a person and an environment in which flourishing remains possible? So our proposal is not to replace mental toughness. It is to give mental toughness a home in which pressure and adversity are taken seriously, a home in which performance still matters, but also a home in which the person remains larger than their performance. Thank you very much, and I will make sure I can answer your questions.